Padre Pio once entered hell for 1 hour. Not in a dream, not in a vision, but in a way he could never fully explain except to say that he was there, in the actual presence of eternal loss. And when he returned, those who knew him said he was never the same. His eyes carried something they had not carried before, a weight, a trembling knowledge that refused to fade. What most people misunderstand about hell is that its greatest torment is not fire or darkness or physical agony. Padre Pio said the unbearable reality of hell is not what happens to the soul, it is what stops happening, forever. And the moment he understood that, standing in that hour of unspeakable truth, he wept in a way no one had ever seen him weep before. Before we continue, please consider subscribing to the channel and letting us know where you're watching from. We read every single comment and truly appreciate you taking the time to listen to the story. The friars who lived with him at San Giovanni Rotondo recorded this experience with trembling hands, not because they doubted him, but because they had witnessed the transformation themselves. They said that before this hour, Padre Pio spoke of hell with theological precision, with doctrinal accuracy, with pastoral concern. But after, he spoke of it with horror, with urgency, with the voice of a man who had stood in the place where hope does not exist and felt what it means to be eternally fixed. He would later tell his spiritual director that the greatest lie humanity believes about damnation is that it is dramatic, that it is operatic, that it involves chains and demons and theatrical suffering. He said the truth is far more terrifying because it is far more ordinary. Hell is not a punishment imposed from the outside. It is a condition solidified from within. It is the human will, perfected in its rejection, made permanent in its choice. And that permanence, that inability to ever change, to ever choose differently, to ever become anything other than what one has chosen to be, that is the fire that never goes out. Not because God kindles it, but because the soul has become the flame itself. Padre Pio said he saw this with a clarity that nearly destroyed him. He saw what eternity looks like when the door to transformation is closed, when mercy is no longer possible not because it is withheld, but because it is refused so completely that refusal becomes identity. And he understood, in that single hour, why the Church has always taught that there is no second chance after death. Not because God is unmerciful, but because the soul, in death, becomes incapable of the kind of change that mercy requires. It happened on a night in autumn, in the year 1911, though the exact date was never recorded because those who witnessed the aftermath were too shaken to think of documentation. Padre Pio had been in his cell at San Giovanni Rotondo for 3 days, and during those 3 days, he had not spoken. Not to the friars who brought him bread, not to the brothers who knocked softly at his door to ask if he needed anything, not even during communal prayer. He stood in the chapel with the others, but his lips did not move. His stigmata, which usually bled in quiet, steady patterns, had begun to bleed differently, heavily. The wounds on his hands soaked through the bandages within hours, and the friars noticed that he winced when he touched anything, as though the pain had intensified beyond what he normally carried. On the 3rd night, something changed. The air in the monastery grew cold, not the cold of winter, but the cold of absence, the kind of cold that comes when warmth is not reduced but removed entirely. Several friars later testified that they felt it simultaneously, a heaviness descending over the building, a thickness in the atmosphere, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Padre Pio was alone in his cell, kneeling before a small wooden crucifix, his hands pressed together despite the pain, his head bowed so low his forehead nearly touched the floor. He had been praying for hours, but his prayers had shifted. No longer prayers of intercession for the living, no longer petitions for the souls in purgatory. These were prayers of preparation, prayers of surrender. The kind of prayers a soul utters when it senses it is about to be taken somewhere it cannot go by its own strength. And then, without sound, without light, without any external sign that something had changed, Padre Pio was no longer kneeling in his cell. He was standing, upright, but not on the wooden floor of San Giovanni Rotondo. He was standing at the edge of something vast and lightless, a threshold he could feel but not see, a boundary between the world he knew and a place where the presence of God, the sustaining love that holds all creation together, had been willfully, consciously, eternally rejected. He did not cross the threshold by choice. He was brought there, pulled, perhaps, or led, though he would never say by whom or by what force. All he would later say is that he knew, the moment he arrived, that he was standing at the entrance to hell, not the hell of metaphor, not the hell of warning, the actual hell, the place where souls exist in the final, unchangeable consequence of their own refusal. And the most terrifying part, the detail that haunted him for the rest of his life, was that there was no drama. No fire falling from above, no voices screaming in agony, just silence, absolute, eternal. The silence of a place where nothing ever changes again. He stepped forward, not by will but by something deeper than will, something that moved him the way gravity moves a stone. And the moment he crossed that threshold, the silence enveloped him like a weight pressing down on every part of his being. Not the silence of an empty room, not the silence of night or solitude or meditation. This was the silence of annihilation. The silence that comes when sound itself has been stripped away, when even the possibility of sound has been rejected. It was so complete, so totalizing, that Padre Pio could not hear his own heartbeat, could not hear his own breathing, could not hear the rustle of his habit, or the movement of air, or the faint hum of existence that underlies all living things. He was standing in the death of sound, and as his eyes adjusted, not to darkness but to a kind of grey, unchanging non-light, he began to see them. The souls. Not writhing in flames, as the paintings in churches depicted, not screaming or clawing at walls or begging for mercy. They were frozen, each one suspended in a single moment, the final moment, the moment of their last choice. A woman stood with her hand raised, her mouth open in mid-sentence, the words she had spoken to dismiss a beggar still hanging in the air around her, like an accusation she would repeat forever. A man sat at a table, his fingers wrapped around a glass, his eyes fixed on nothing, trapped eternally in the instant he chose drunkenness over his wife's tears. A young priest, his collar still crisp, his face still handsome, stood before a mirror, admiring his own reflection, forever caught in the moment he chose vanity over vocation. And they were alone, perfectly, completely alone. Each soul existed in its own isolated eternity, separated from every other soul by an invisible chasm that could never be crossed. No communion, no connection, no possibility of reaching out or being reached. Padre Pio moved among them, and the most devastating realization was that he recognized some of them. Not all, but some. Faces he had seen in his confessional. Faces that had knelt before him and confessed sins and received absolution, and then walked away. Not once, but many times. He saw a man who had come to him 5 times, confessing the same sin, receiving the same forgiveness, and then returning to the same choice until the day he stopped coming at all. He saw a woman who had wept in his presence, who had promised to change, who had left his confessional with hope in her eyes, and then chosen, over and over, the small comforts of her resentment until resentment became her entire self. And now they were here, fixed, frozen. Not because God had condemned them, but because they had become the thing they chose. And in hell, you do not suffer for what you chose. You suffer by being what you chose, forever, without change, without growth, without the possibility of becoming anything other than the single moment of refusal that defined you. But then Padre Pio saw something that shattered him in a way the silence and the isolation had not. He saw that these souls were not simply frozen in their final moment, they were reliving it, over and over, in an endless, unchangeable loop. The woman with her hand raised was not trapped in a static image. She was speaking the words again, dismissing the beggar again, choosing her comfort over his need again, and again, and again, not because some external force was torturing her with the memory, but because she could not stop. The choice had become so deeply part of her that it was no longer a choice at all. It was her identity. She was the dismissal, she was the refusal, and she would repeat it forever because she had made herself into nothing else. Padre Pio watched, horrified, as a man of extraordinary intelligence, a scholar, a teacher, a man who had been admired by everyone who knew him, stood in the center of his own eternal moment. He was laughing. Not the laugh of joy, but the laugh of contempt. The laugh he had made when a simple, uneducated believer had tried to speak to him about mercy, about grace, about the need to humble oneself before God. And the scholar had laughed, had dismissed the idea with intellectual superiority, had chosen his own brilliance over the possibility of being wrong, and now he was laughing still, the same laugh, the same sneer, the same moment of pride repeating forever, and he could not stop. His intelligence, which he had worshipped, had become his prison. He was trapped in the smartest version of himself, the version that knew everything except how to kneel. Nearby, a woman of great beauty and social standing stood before an invisible mirror, arranging her appearance, smoothing her dress, perfecting the image she would present to others. She had lived her entire life for appearances, for reputation, for what people thought of her. And in her final moments, when a priest had come to offer her the sacrament, when her family had begged her to confess her sins and receive mercy, she had refused. Not because she did not believe, but because she could not bear the thought of anyone knowing she had sinned, could not bear the humiliation of admitting she needed forgiveness. She had chosen her reputation over her soul, and now she was trapped in that choice. Adjusting her dress, perfecting her image, preparing to be seen. But no one was watching, no one would ever watch. She was alone, and she would prepare forever. And the worst part, the revelation that broke Padre Pio so completely that he fell to his knees in that terrible place, was that these souls could not stop choosing. The choice had become their substance. They were not people who had made a choice. They were the choice itself, given eternal form, and there was no force in heaven or earth or hell that could unmake what they had made themselves into. And then, without warning, without transition, without any sense of movement or passage, Padre Pio was no longer there. He was on the floor of his cell, collapsed, his body curled inward like a man who had been struck. His hands, still bearing the wounds of the stigmata, were pressed against his face, and his face was wet, soaked, not with sweat, but with tears he did not remember crying, tears that had poured from him in that place, or after, or during the return, he could not say. Time had stopped making sense. The hour he had spent in hell had felt both like a single instant and like an eternity, both like a breath and like 1,000 years. His mind could not reconcile what he had experienced with the fact that he was now back in the world where change was possible, where grace still moved, where souls could still choose differently than they had chosen before. He lay there, trembling, his entire body shaking with a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. The friars found him at dawn. Brother Agostino was the first to enter, bringing bread and water as he did every morning, and when he opened the door he saw Padre Pio on the floor, his habit soaked with sweat and tears, his eyes open but unseeing, his lips moving without sound. He called for the others. They lifted him onto his bed. They tried to speak to him, to ask what had happened, but Padre Pio could not answer. He could not form words. His throat worked, his mouth opened, but nothing came out except a sound like weeping without breath. For 3 days, he remained in this state, silent, trembling, staring at the crucifix on the wall as though seeing it for the first time. The friars took turns sitting with him, praying over him, wiping his face when the tears started again, which they did, without warning, in sudden waves that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than grief. On the morning of the 4th day, Padre Pio spoke. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, and his first words were not an explanation, not a description of what he had seen. His first words were a plea. He begged for confession. The friars were confused. Padre Pio had just been to confession 2 days before his experience. He had no serious sins to confess. He had lived a life of extraordinary holiness, of penance, of prayer, but he insisted. He wept and begged and would not be calmed until Father Benedetto, his spiritual director, agreed to hear him. And when they were alone, Padre Pio did not confess sins. He confessed fear. He confessed the terror that what he had seen might somehow still be true of him, that he might, even now, even after all his prayers and sacrifices, still be capable of the kind of refusal that leads to that place. He needed to hear, out loud, that grace was still possible, That change was still real, that he was not frozen, not trapped, not beyond the reach of mercy. He needed to reaffirm, in the most tangible way the Church offers, that he was still alive in the way that matters most, still capable of becoming something other than what he had been. From that day forward, everything about Padre Pio's ministry changed. His confessional, which had always been a place of gentle guidance and patient counsel, became a place of fierce spiritual combat. He no longer treated sin as a minor inconvenience to be absolved and forgotten. He treated it as a creeping paralysis, a slow freezing of the soul that could, if left unchecked, become permanent. People who came to him expecting routine forgiveness found themselves confronted by a man who wept over their sins as though witnessing a death. He would grab them by the shoulders, his wounded hands gripping them with surprising strength, and beg them not to wait, not to assume they had more time, not to treat mercy as though it were infinite in duration rather than infinite in depth. He became almost violent in his urgency, not because he was angry, but because he had seen where delay leads, where complacency ends, where the belief that one can always change later becomes the inability to change at all. When people asked him about hell, expecting descriptions of fire and brimstone, of demons with pitchforks and lakes of sulfur, he would grow quiet. He would look at them with those eyes that had seen what no living person should see, and he would say, very simply, very clearly, in a voice that carried the weight of absolute truth, "It is the place where nothing can ever change again." And then he would pause, letting the words settle, letting them penetrate, and he would add, "Do not wait, do not assume, do not believe you have more time. Choose now, while choosing is still possible." This became his most repeated warning, his spiritual signature, the phrase that everyone who encountered him remembered long after they had forgotten everything else, because he did not say it casually, he did not say it as a theological proposition or a pastoral suggestion. He said it as a man who had stood at the edge of eternity and understood, with a clarity that nearly destroyed him, that the ability to choose is not a permanent feature of existence. It is a gift, a temporary gift. And when it is withdrawn, not by God's cruelty, but by the soul's own solidification into refusal, there is no appeal, no second chance, no possibility of revision. The souls he had seen were not being punished for,